Hi, I'm Lalita from Let's Speak English, and in this lesson I'm going to show a lot of great phrases and expressions for making a very effective presentation in English. So let's get started. But before we go on to the expressions, do not forget to like and subscribe to my channel Let's Speak English. So presentation always starts with an introduction. So how do you introduce yourself as well as you welcome the audience? So you start by saying good morning, good afternoon or good evening everybody, and welcome to my presentation. And my name is Lalita Shankar and I am the Chief Marketing Manager at ABC. So that's how you introduce yourself as well as you welcome the audience. Apart from that, the topic of the presentation is to introduce the topic, you could say, the topic of my presentation is, or today I'd like to talk to you about. So that's how you introduce. This is a very standard way of introduction, but that's okay. Now let's get back to something that you might want to do before beginning your first point. And it might be a good idea to let your audience know the structure of your presentation. In other words, you have to give your audience an overview of your presentation. And you could do it by saying this: I'm going to focus on or look at or deal with 3 main points. Or you could say, I have divided my presentation into 3 main points. First of all, I'll talk about. Second, we'll look at. And finally, I'll explain or show you or tell you about something. So that's how you give an overview. And if your audience is not aware of the length of your presentation, it'll do you good if you inform them. You could tell that by saying, my presentation will take about 30 minutes or maybe 45 minutes. And regarding questions at the end of your presentation, in case you're really hard for time regarding your presentation, you could always say, there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end of my presentation. Or you could say, I'd appreciate if you could leave any questions you may have until the end of my presentation. On the other hand, if you are flexible and welcome question anytime, you could say something like this: if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to interrupt at any time. So that's about the questions. Moving on. Now you have made your introduction and it's now time to start with the main part or the body of your presentation. And this is when signposting phrases can be very useful. There are phrases that can guide your audience through presentation to let them know when we are starting with a new topic or when we are coming to an end of a topic. So what are those expressions? So you can say something like this: I'd like to begin by telling you or showing you, etc. Now, a point of caution here: begin by is always followed by a gerund, that is a verb plus ing. For example, telling you, showing you. Or you could use another expression, let's start with. Or there's another way which is really very effective. So let's get started. Now, so is a very simple and effective word to get your audience attention. So that's how you introduce your first point. And when you're finished with your first point, you could say something like this: So that covers everything that I want to say about point number 1. Or you could say that concludes my first point. Now when you transition to the second point, you could always say something like this. Now let's move to my next topic, which is, or let's turn now to, or moving on to. So these are the expressions that will help you in transiting to the next point very smoothly. Now, when you want to introduce charts or maybe even graphs in your presentation, you could always use expressions like this. So as you can see on this chart, or take a look at this chart, this graph clearly shows, or this graph highlights the importance of. So that's how you introduce your charts and graphs. Well, sometimes it's more important to get into more details of a certain point. So let's take a look on how we do that. You could use expressions like, let me expand on this point, or I'd like to elaborate on this point for a few minutes. Now, it's very important to remind your audience why the topic is relevant or important. And you can do that by saying something like this. As said in the beginning, or this relates to what I was saying earlier, or this ties in with what I said at the beginning of my talk or presentation. So you relate to the things that you might have told at the beginning of your presentation towards the point that you're referring to now. So that's how you bring the relation into your speech or presentation. Moving to the last part of the presentation, here we usually summarize the main points and give a conclusion or final message, and thank the audience and invite them to ask questions. How do we summarize? So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Or you could say we looked at 3 points. First, I showed you or spoke about. You could also say, then we looked at, and finally I explained or told you about. So that's how you summarize. Now the concluding bit. I'd like to conclude and with a point, or before I finish, I'd like to leave you with one final thought. So you give the audience some points to ponder, and then you thank the audience and invite them to ask questions. So you could say, thank you very much for your attention or time, or thank you for listening, or if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them now. So with that, I'm coming to the end of my presentation, and I hope this video was helpful to you. Do not forget to like and subscribe to my channel, Let's Speak English.